Good evening. My name is Isabelle Teare with the WTJX Newsfeed, and this is Trial Watch, where we're going to recap the proceedings that happened today on, excuse me, we're gonna give that away. Sorry about that. Okay, so we are going to recap the proceedings that happened today in the case the United States versus Calvert White and Benjamin Hendricks. This is the case involving the former commissioner of the Department of Sports, Parks, and Recreation and a government contractor who allegedly solicited bribes in exchange for getting a certain government contract. So, court started a little bit late today. Yesterday, we had jury selection and opening statements, and that, jury selection took a lot of the day. Then opening statements were pretty brief, but today was where we really dove into, the grit of this case and everything that's happening. But it did start a little bit late. The judge had another, case that he had to deal with beforehand. And while we were all waiting to go into the courtroom, something that was just interesting to see, Calvert White went and spoke with Benjamin Hendricks before going into the courtroom. Hendricks was kind of tucked away in an alcove, and White went and joined him in that alcove, and they were there for a couple minutes talking. This is just, an interesting note because it's the first time that I've seen them interact in this courtroom setting. While they're in court, they never really interact. They didn't interact yesterday, didn't even look at each other during the trial. When we all went into the courtroom, there were about 20 people sitting there and watching, and one of them was Celestino White. That's Calvert White's father, the former senator, and he currently sits on the board for the Virgin Islands Port Authority. Important to remember that because he's actually going to come up a little later on when we hear some recordings that the United States introduced as evidence. So let's dive right in. So when the judge started things off, it was the United States who called their first witness. And the first witness they called was a man named Corey Romney Jr. He is a contract administrator for the Department of Property and Procurement. And what he was questioned on was his role relating to a contract for the Department of Sports, Parks, and Recreation to have security cameras installed in late 2023. Romney's position, he was basically one of the people who was on an evaluation committee to evaluate different bids that came in for this contract. For those who aren't familiar with how this works, the government sends out a request for proposals about a certain contract, in this case, security cameras. And different companies can come in and bid, explain their services and what it's going to cost. And this is supposed to be a confidential process, Romney said. What happens is these bids come in and him and a team would evaluate the bids. They would then vote on these and figure out who was going to win this government contract. So he was part of this evaluation committee. He said it was 5 people on this committee. And what ended up happening was there were 2 bids that were kind of tied almost. And they were trying to figure out which one they were going to go with for these security cameras. One of them was for Monethos Pro Support, the company formerly owned by David Whitaker. And the other was a company called SmartNet. We're going to hear that brought up several times later on during testimony. So Romney said that these contracts were very close in their amount. And so what the typical process was for the government to go forward and have follow-up meetings with these 2 companies to better understand their bid. And this is the big part of his testimony. What he said was that at the time, Commissioner of SPR, Calvert White, was a part of these evaluation meetings. And the reason that's important is because while commissioners could be a part of these meetings, he said it was not normal for commissioners to sit in on these meetings. And then in cross-examination, Calvert White's attorney, Clive Rivers, said well, isn't it normal for someone from the department to sit in on this? And Romney said, yeah, it was normal for someone from the department to sit in on these meetings, but that it just wasn't normal for a commissioner to be there. And that wrapped up Romney's testimony. The next witness that the United States called also worked and works for property and procurement, and this was Malachi Thomas. Malachi Thomas, he has worked with property and procurement since 2021. His current role is Chief Procurement Officer. But back when, in late 2023, when this specific contract was getting discussed, he was a senior contract administrator, and his responsibility really started after the contract had been passed, had gone through the bid process. It was once they had selected the company that was going to do the work. So by the time Malachi Thomas is involved, Monethos has already been selected. And it was his role to draft up these contracts. And so what he said is that his testimony was really about the fact that Calvert White was commenting on these drafted contracts. And what he said was that this was honestly not out of the norm. Where we heard Romney testify earlier that it was out of the norm for a commissioner to sit on those meetings, what Malachi Thomas said was that with bigger government agencies and government departments, having a commissioner really involved in the contract process would have been odd because they had a lot more responsibility. But he said with smaller departments like Sports, Parks, and Rec, having Calvert White, the commissioner, it wasn't that out of the norm. And so, but the really important thing that was driven home by the United States here was that the price of the contract, by the time it got to Malachi Thomas, it was locked in place. It wasn't up for debate. And he confirmed that, yes, by the time he was looking at things, the price was already locked in. Then we went and everybody had a break for lunch because the next witness was going to be the main witness in the case, David Whitaker, the former owner of Monethos Pro Support. And so we took a break and then we came back and David Whitaker took the stand. He was wearing a blue suit and a white shirt, and he sat up there and answered some general questions from the United States Attorney about, why he was there. And he said that in late 2023, he participated in a Sports Parks and Rec proposal for security cameras. This is what the whole case kind of hinges on. And he said that he was first approached by Benjamin Hendricks in St. Croix during the Christmas festivals. And he said that Benjamin Hendricks told him that Calvert White wanted to have a conversation with him. And now this is where we get into a long day of looking at exhibits, and a lot of those exhibits were calls, recordings of calls, or recordings of conversations. And what it's really good to note here is that when you're in the courtroom and you're hearing these recordings, they're really difficult to understand, a lot of them. There's a lot of background noise, there's music playing, and all of that. And so what we were shown was a transcript alongside those calls. And without that transcript, where you can kind of pick up key words and things, it's really hard to understand what's happening in those calls. So the first call that we hear is a recording between David Whitaker and Calvert White. And in it, Calvert White is asking Whitaker to talk with Benji Hendricks about this contract. And Whitaker said that he did then reach out to Benjamin Hendricks. And he says that Benjamin Hendricks told him that for 1% of the cost of the contract, Calvert White would help him get that contract. And what we didn't know, and obviously the defendants didn't know, is that Whitaker then went and directly reported that to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That's what we heard today. He sent a text and called an FBI agent. And he did this because he was under an obligation with a plea deal with the government. He was a cooperating witness because of past, because he was a convicted felon and was participating in these plea agreements. So right from the jump, the FBI is aware that Calvert White is talking with David Whitaker. And we then see a WhatsApp message up as evidence where Calvert White is, again, communicating with Whitaker about communicating with Benjamin Hendricks, who, served as the middleman between these guys throughout this case. So the next phone call we hear is a recording of a phone call between Whitaker and Benjamin Hendricks. And in that, we hear David Whitaker say he only wants 1%, $16K, and the he's referring to is Calvert White. Benjamin Hendricks then said, that's what he said. If he wants to change it, and he kind of trails off and we can't hear what he says after that, but that's what he told me. So once again, this is, showing Benjamin Hendricks acting as this middleman between them. And the attorney for the United States, Alex Dempsey, asked Whitaker, what did that 1% mean? And Whitaker said that 1% was in reference to the $16,000 that was requested by Calvert White in exchange for his help getting this contract. Now, a few days later, David Whitaker said he had another conversation, but this time that conversation was in person and it was with Calvert White. So in this recording, we hear Calvert White say, I hope you got a photographic memory because I'm not going to let you walk with all that. And what we end up finding out over the course of this recording is that Calvert White is showing David Whitaker confidential information about these contracts that have been submitted. One of them is from that company that I referred to earlier, SmartNet. Remember how I said there were those two companies competing, and they were the two that the department was really looking at for getting this contract? It was SmartNet and Monethos Pro Support. And so Calvert White says that SmartNet bid at $1.8 million. And he said that everybody else was way over. SmartNet's the only one that's kind of in that range. And then we hear David Whitaker say, we can do it around $1.5 million and cover everything. So this is really them getting into the specifics of these contracts, who paid what, giving David Whitaker that confidential information that's going to allow him to basically outbid other competitors. The next evidence we hear is a continuation of that meeting between David Whitaker and Benjamin Hendricks. And in this, they once again are just kind of talking about more competitors. Once again, there were a lot of recordings and a lot of exhibits that were introduced today. So another back and forth about, other competitors in this process. After that, we are seeing for the first time, they showed us a video. This video was paired with an audio recording and then that transcript. And in the video, we see Calvert White, Benjamin Hendricks, and David Whitaker hanging out in a parking lot area outside of the St. Croix village in Frederickstead. There's a police van in the background. There are a bunch of government vehicles. And, they're just having a conversation. But the recording, we hear Calvert White say, is Benji going to be able to give me something to go into that meeting? And then Whitaker says, he said you wanted 16,000. That's kind of low, 1%. And then we hear Calvert White say, I'm not greedy. So the meeting that they're discussing is this upcoming evaluation meeting where they are going to discuss, the department is going to discuss these two contracts and who should get it. Then this conversation continues and David Whitaker says, let me know how to get you the wire. They then start discussing how this payment is going to come through, this $16,000, and they're talking about how it's going to come through in installments. We then hear Calvert White say it can't be a check. And David Whitaker asks, okay, should I give it to Benji? Then Calvert White says, this isn't for me to try to get rich on you. There's more back and forth about this, but as you can tell, these conversations are pretty explicit about a plan and how they're going to go about exchanging this money. This conversation ends with Calvert White saying, "I'll let Benji deal with it, but get me whatever you can." Calvert White then leaves the conversation. But this conversation continued between David Whitaker and Benjamin Hendricks. And this is where one of the biggest bombshells from today was dropped. What I want you to understand is that previously a lot of what we'd been hearing really focused on the exacts, the specifics around this 16,000, the contract with Monethos, all of that. But for the first time, we start hearing Benjamin Hendricks and David Whitaker start talking about other government officials, of other government departments. And so we heard some names, and I'm just going to tell you what was heard on the tape. So Whitaker is recorded as saying, "I've got Ray, Jennifer, the governor." And in this, he's referring to Ray Martinez, the former police commissioner, Jennifer O'Neill, the former director of OMB, both of whom have upcoming trials related to their own indictments over soliciting bribes involving Monethos and David Whitaker. And then we hear Benjamin Hendricks say, "You need to get Carlton. You could even get DPNR, JP Oriole." He's referring to Carlton Dow, the head of the Virgin Islands Port Authority, and also JP Oriole, the commissioner for the Department of Planning and Natural Resources. An important note I want to stress here is that we're not sure exactly what context they're talking about here. We're hearing these names, we're hearing these discussions, but the specifics aren't mentioned. It's a very general back and forth conversation. Benjamin Hendricks then says they work together. Sports Parks and Rec, DPNR, Carlton Dow, Virgin Islands Port Authority. He says, "You get the mix, all three." And then Benjamin Hendricks goes and starts referring back to Monethos and Calvert White and that specific contract. And he says, "Get him 4 going into the meeting Thursday," referring to getting Calvert White this money ahead of that evaluation meeting about these bids. So then the conversation continues. Benjamin Hendricks starts just talking again generally with David Whitaker about Calvert White as a person, what his role, his position in the community. And Benjamin Hendricks says, "That boy has a lot of influence. You hear me?" He then mentions a company called Southland Gaming. And things got a little explicit in the recording here, but he says, "Southland Gaming, them effers love him," referring to Calvert White. He then says, "Yeah, Calvert's all over Southland Gaming." And so conversation continues. We go back to talking about Monethos, and David Whitaker says, "Yeah, I got to get a wire transfer." Benjamin Hendricks says, "Okay, good." Now, the conversation continued, but just so you know, the United States broke these exhibits up. So we were hearing, part of a recording. This was one long conversation, but we were hearing it in chunks, and then they would do a little bit of questioning between the chunks. So the next chunk of this recording, we hear Benjamin Hendricks say that he has to deal with something for the Virgin Islands Port Authority, but he just wants to make sure that David Whitaker he just wants to make sure that we take care of him. And the him he's referring to is Calvert White. And David Whitaker says, "Cash?" And Benji Hendricks says, yeah. So this is now finally the end of that long recording where we heard a lot of really interesting information dropped. And this was the longest recording and the longest introduction of evidence we heard, today in total. The next introduction, the next exhibit were screenshots between Benjamin Hendricks and David Whitaker. These were a little easier to digest, obviously. It's quick, it's back and forth. Benjamin Hendricks says $5K for C. David Whitaker says not 4. And when questioned about this, David Whitaker said that this meant, this was Benjamin Hendricks telling him to send $5,000 to Calvert White. Whitaker says he then had a call with Benjamin Hendricks after this text was sent, and we did hear that recording of the call. This was one of the recordings that was very, very easily understood. You wouldn't have needed the transcript to understand what they were saying. And in it, we hear Benjamin Hendricks and Whitaker talking about when First Bank closes and whether or not David Whitaker is going to be able to get to First Bank before it closes to send this money. And Whitaker asks, if I don't make it, is it okay to get it to him sometime tomorrow during the day? Benjamin Hendricks says, yeah. Then the conversation continues, and Benjamin Hendricks is just saying, whatever is going to be easiest or best for him. And the him he's referring to is Calvert White. And Whitaker says, I've sent you wires before. I'll just send you a wire for Calvert. And Hendricks says, yeah, you're right. This conversation is important in the context of the next exhibit. The next exhibit is the first time we see a bank document that was presented to the jury and those of us watching the case unfold. And this bank document was a wire confirmation from First Bank. And this wire confirmation was for a transaction that happened on January 3rd of 2024 for $5,000. It went from the company Monethos Pro Support to the company A Clean Environment. Now, if you'll remember from earlier, Benjamin Hendricks was a government contractor who owned a company, who currently owns a company called A Clean Environment. And so what was happening was Whitaker was sending the money to, what the United States is alleging is that Whitaker was sending the money to Benji Hendricks' company, and it would then be disseminated to Calvert White. An important note on this document, we see there is kind of a memo line on this wire confirmation, and in that it says partial payment for contract. We then move on to the next exhibit. These are text messages between Whitaker and Hendricks, and Whitaker says, in this text, wire sent for Cal. It should be in your account tomorrow. And after this exhibit is introduced, we hear attorney Alex Dempsey, who represents the United States, start questioning Whitaker about this exchange. Dempsey says, Whitaker, did you personally pay that $5,000 that was wired? And Whitaker says, no, he didn't. It was actually the Department of Justice who reimbursed him for that $5,000. And he says, once again, this was because while all of this was unfolding, Whitaker was already a cooperating witness with the government. We then moved on to a little bit of questioning about David Whitaker's past. As we've all probably heard, he's been called a con man a lot. And so Attorney Dempsey kind of dove into that a bit. He said, are you a convicted felon? David Whitaker said, yes, I am. And then they started discussing the plea deals that Whitaker had been involved in. He's a convicted felon for, crimes going back to 1997. And what he explained was that he had accepted plea deals in the past where he would cooperate with the government and it would lower his jail time. So, for instance, one of his sentences, it was initially 5 years, and by cooperating with the government, it was lowered. But what was important to note about this today was that David Whitaker admitted to pleading guilty to 3 criminal schemes that are currently ongoing in the VI. However, he's still awaiting sentencing for those 3 criminal schemes. And this was where Attorney Dempsey asked him if the government had made any direct promises to Whitaker in exchange for his testimony. Whitaker said no, the government had not made him any direct promises. Attorney Dempsey then said, but you believe that your cooperation may help in terms of your sentencing down the line. And to that, Whitaker responded yes. So that was just an interesting thing to hear, that there isn't apparently already an exact agreement, locked in between David Whitaker and the government as it relates to the plea deal with the 3 crimes in the VI. This has obviously been a long day at this point. We then get a comfort break, about 10 minutes, where the jury was excused. Everyone in the courthouse was excused to, use the restroom, grab some water if they needed to. And when we came back, we had Attorney Dempsey go right back into questioning David Whitaker, and he asked him if Calvert White was aware that Whitaker was a convicted felon. Whitaker said yes, he had told Calvert White. He had had conversations with White where he had discussed this with him. And then there was a little bit more conversation about that exhibit, which was the bank wire confirmation. And this was where the attorney really had Whitaker explain why the wire went from Monethos to A Clean Environment rather than from, Whitaker himself to Calvert White himself. So they discussed that a little bit. Then we are introduced to another exhibit, which is another recording. And this recording was Calvert White participating in that evaluation meeting. So he's participating in that evaluation meeting, and we assume it's on Teams or some other virtual platform, but at the same time, he has David Whitaker on the phone. And so what they're talking about is the specifics. David Whitaker is trying to direct him to certain areas in that contract that he should, point out as beneficial. And this is happening because at this point, Calvert White isn't supposed to have seen all of this documentation. So at that point, he has Whitaker on the line trying to explain where to look in this contract. Sorry, just got to catch up with my notes. It was a long day. Flipping through here. Okay, so then after that meeting takes place, another exhibit is introduced where Benjamin Hendricks asks Whitaker if he had heard from Calvert White following this big evaluation meeting. And after that, Whitaker said, yes, he had heard from Calvert White, when Calvert White apparently told him, he said, we got it. Then Benjamin Hendricks says, yeah, I heard that too. And he also said that he had made a phone call to an individual, and he says that individual was one of the senators, and that senator had told him, Benji, don't worry about it. But when the attorney asked Whitaker if he knew who that senator was, Whitaker said he did not. So that senator was never identified in court today. The Attorney Dempsey, then asked what happened next in that RFP process. And Whitaker said the next thing that happened was he received an award letter, which then began and this award letter is saying, okay, you won the contract. And this then began negotiations about this contract between the government and then Whitaker's company. Whitaker said that he wasn't the one involved in these contract negotiations at this point. It was someone who worked for him, and that person was Anthony Thomas. And a final really important note, again, that was kind of mentioned earlier, David Whitaker said the final contract that went back and forth that they were negotiating, he signed it, but it was never signed by the government. And when the attorney for the United States asked why it was never signed by the government, Whitaker said he wasn't sure. Okay, so this wraps up a long day of recordings and the United States examining this pivotal witness in this case. And so it's now time for the defense to cross-examine. And so we have Clive Rivers come up to the stand, and Clive Rivers comes up. David Whitaker is still on the stand. And Rivers asks if December 2023 was the first time that Whitaker had met Calvert White. Whitaker said no, he had known Calvert White for a few years, and that they were actually introduced by by a man he called Benny D, in relation to certain athletes coming down to St. Thomas for something. Clive Rivers then continued a couple more questions and got to this point where he asked if Whitaker had ever tracked Calvert White on Facebook. And this was kind of an odd moment because Whitaker stood back and said he needed a second to think about that question. And he had actually probably a little over a minute where it was silence in the courtroom for him to think about his response. He then said, yes, there were times where he, as a cybersecurity person employed by the government, as a government contractor, where he was told to track Calvert White for various reasons. He said that he captured certain things on his Facebook page and that he was monitoring it. We weren't really informed about why Clive Rivers was going down this line of questioning, but that was a line of questioning that took a little bit of time. Then Clive Rivers dove into talking about David Whitaker's past and his criminal history. He said, were you first arrested in New Orleans in 1997? And Whitaker said he couldn't remember the exact charges, but yes, he was arrested. And it ended up being for credit card fraud. And Clive Rivers then followed up with some more questions about the exact nature of the charges, and it came out that it was not just credit card fraud, it was bank fraud, it was racketeering, and this all happened back in 1997. After a little bit of back and forth, David Whitaker said, yes, that sounds correct. Clive Rivers then said, okay, well, you were also arrested in 2001, weren't you? Whitaker said, yes, he was. And this was because he violated his probation from the earlier charge. It was also because he was writing bad checks, and he served 24 months in prison for this. He was then released in 2004, and Clive Rivers asked, okay, you were then arrested in 2004, the same year you were released, again for credit card fraud, and you served 10 months in jail? Whitaker said, yes, that sounded correct. Then we go on to the next incident where Rivers said, what did you do after that in Rhode Island? Whitaker said that while he was living between Rhode Island and Miami around 2006, he owned a company that sold consumer electronics. And when asked how he got into trouble with this company, he said that the company sold more products than they could deliver, and that they kept selling products and never delivered them. Rivers said that in less than a year of this happening, that Whitaker billed more than $7 million to clients. And that he asked if he had also gotten into trouble with credit card companies about this. Whitaker said yes, and when asked if he had paid that money back, Whitaker said no, he hadn't. Rivers then asked him about a house that he rented in Miami at this time in 2006. And this is important because after the jury left, it was something that got brought up, and the judge had to kind of deliberate between the defense and the prosecution. So keep this, in the back of your head. This house, Clive Rivers asks if David Whitaker paid $200,000 a month for a home in Miami at the time. Whitaker says, yes, he was paying $200,000 a month for a home in Miami. Now, this is where the testimony for the day wrapped up. It's now 5 o'clock in court, and certain jurors had to be dismissed before 5:15. So the Judge Mark Kearney, went and dismissed the jurors and said that they would pick up with Clive Rivers' cross-examination tomorrow, first thing in the morning. It wasn't cutting Attorney Rivers off. It was just they were going to have to pick this up tomorrow. So the jury exited the courtroom, and immediately after they exited, attorneys for the United States stood up and said that they had an objection to certain things that Clive Rivers had brought up in his cross-examination. And at the time, one of the attorneys had tried to object, back when Rivers was doing his cross, but the judge overruled that objection. So the United States was now bringing back up that objection, trying to explain more and, hopefully get their case heard. And what Dempsey, the attorney for the U.S., said was that Rivers was not allowed to go into, all of these specific details about what was happening in relation to David Whitaker's past crimes over 10 years ago. He said that under Rule 609, the defense was only allowed to say what the convictions were. The judge then said, and kind of said, I didn't understand that's what you were objecting to when you objected during Rivers' cross. But then Clive Rivers came back up and tried to explain why he asked those questions about the $200,000 to begin with. He said that the $200,000 a month house that Whitaker was paying for was relevant because it went towards his scheming, he said. And the judge then challenged this, and he said, does it matter where a person lives? Rivers said, yeah, it does matter where that person lives. It goes to him using all of these funds for a lifestyle. Attorney Darren John Baptiste, who represents Benjamin Hendricks, who we had not heard from at all today, this was the first time he got up and spoke, he said, yes, this information was relevant because it, showed the witness's lifestyle and how it plays a role in his overall criminal scheme. The judge kind of challenged this again and said, so the witness's lifestyle in 2002, is going to tie into 2023. The defense said, yes, it did. At this point, the judge said, okay, you know what, I'm going to review this and we'll address this again tomorrow morning. There wasn't a ruling administered on this. So both the prosecution and the defense kind of stated their case about where they lied, where they were at in terms of these details of Whitaker's crimes getting brought up. And then Clive Rivers tried to debate this a little bit further, and the judge kind of shut it down and said, read the room. He literally said, read the room. Everybody wants to go home. We'll deal with this tomorrow. And that is where court wrapped today around 5:15, and everyone was dismissed. The judge, before dismissing everyone, said that court would begin promptly at 8:30 tomorrow morning, where we would dive right back into cross-examination done by Clive Rivers. So I know this was a lot of information to digest. It was a long day of court. A lot of things were said. But we have another day tomorrow. And after a long day of those proceedings, we will be right back here tomorrow night. And we're going to give you a full recap, just like we did today, about everything that comes out in court tomorrow. So I hope you'll join us again tomorrow for Trial Watch. Once again, my name is Isabelle Teare with the WTJX Newsfeed. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night.